In a cave in northern Spain, scientists reconstructed a skull from 52 shattered pieces, and what they found inside those fragments looked less like an accident and more like a crime scene. The skull is called Cranium 17. It belonged to a young adult who lived 430,000 years ago, and above the left eye, researchers found two nearly identical fractures made by the same object from two different angles. That detail matters more than you'd think. An accidental fall usually leaves one wound. This left two, and that changes everything about what we're looking at. So here's the question this video is built around. When did humans first kill each other on purpose? Not by accident? Not for food, but murder, the way we define it today. In the next few minutes, we're going into the oldest suspected murder case in the human fossil record, a 10,000-year-old massacre site that some scientists now dispute, and the unsettling detail buried inside a single skull that tells us who the killer probably was. Let's start with Cranium 17. The skull was found at a site called Sima de los Huesos, which translates to Pit of Bones, deep inside the Atapuerca Mountains in Spain. The only way into the site is through a vertical shaft, over 40 feet straight down. At least 28 individuals were found at the bottom of that pit, and researchers believe most of them were placed there deliberately, making this one of the earliest known burial sites in human history. Think about that for a moment. Whoever these people were, they cared enough about their dead to carry bodies to a hidden shaft and drop them down into darkness on purpose. That's not just biology. That's the beginning of something closer to culture. But Cranium 17 was different. Researchers ruled out an accidental fall down the shaft because a fall would need to strike the exact same spot twice, from two different angles, which is essentially impossible. The wounds also sat above the left eye, on the face. Here's the pattern interrupt. Accidental injuries tend to land on the side of the head. Deliberate violence tends to target the face. Whoever did this was standing in front of their victim, not behind them. Researchers published their findings in the journal PLOS One in 2015, concluding that Cranium 17 represents the earliest documented case of lethal interpersonal violence in the human fossil record. In plain language, the oldest known murder. Now, if that sounds like an isolated case, it isn't. At a site called Nataruk, near Lake Turkana in Kenya, archaeologists uncovered the remains of 27 people dating back roughly 10,000 years. 10 of the skeletons showed clear signs of violent death. Blunt force trauma to skulls and cheekbones, broken hands, knees, and ribs. Arrow wounds to the neck. 2 of the men had stone projectile tips still embedded in their skulls and chests. Researchers noted that some of the victims appeared to have had their hands bound. None of the bodies were buried. They were simply left where they fell, on the edge of a lagoon, for 10,000 years, until archaeologists found them in 2012, still lying in the exact position they died in. What makes Nataruk especially unsettling is what it wasn't. This wasn't a single one-on-one killing like Cranium 17. Researchers found evidence that some of the weapons used, including a type of volcanic glass called obsidian, weren't naturally available anywhere near the site itself. That detail suggests the attackers didn't live locally. They traveled from somewhere else, carrying weapons with them, which implies planning, not a spontaneous fight that got out of hand. The lead researcher on the study called it early evidence of warfare between hunter-gatherer groups, not just isolated violence between individuals. Here's the twist most people don't expect, though. Not every scientist agrees with that conclusion. A separate group of researchers published a formal challenge to the massacre interpretation, arguing that some of the skeletal damage could have occurred naturally after burial, through the shifting and pressure of sediment over thousands of years, rather than from actual violence at the time of death. So even our best evidence for ancient warfare isn't fully settled, which raises an uncomfortable question. If scientists still argue about evidence that's only 10,000 years old, how much of our violent past is buried more deeply than we'll ever be able to prove? Here's a pattern interrupt worth sitting with, though. Maybe the question isn't just when humans started killing each other. Maybe it's whether this behavior even started with humans at all. In the 1970s, primatologist Jane Goodall documented something that shocked the entire scientific world. A chimpanzee community at Gombe National Park in Tanzania split into two rival groups. Over the next 4 years, males from the larger group systematically hunted down and killed every single adult male from the smaller splinter group, one by one, in coordinated ambushes. Goodall had spent years believing chimpanzees were, in her own words, nicer than humans. Watching this unfold changed her mind completely. For years, critics argued Goodall's presence had somehow caused this violence, that wild chimpanzees left alone would never behave this way. But later studies observing chimpanzee communities across Africa, using far less intrusive methods, confirmed the same pattern repeating itself. Coordinated, lethal, male-driven violence between rival groups wasn't a fluke at Gombe. It appears to be a real, recurring feature of chimpanzee society in the wild. If our closest living relatives are capable of organized killing without ever inventing language, tools for war, or anything resembling human culture, that pushes the origin of this behavior back even further than any fossil could prove. Maybe murder isn't something that appeared at some point in human history. Maybe it's something that was already sitting inside the evolutionary tree, long before humans existed to inherit it. Now here's the detail from Cranium 17 that should genuinely unsettle you. Researchers didn't just determine that the victim was murdered. They used the angle and position of the wounds to work out something else entirely: the likely handedness of the killer. Because the fractures landed on the left side of the face, researchers concluded the blows most likely came from a right-handed individual standing face-to-face with the victim. And here's what makes that detail land differently. Separate studies on the broader population found at the same site suggest that most of these ancient hominins were right-handed too, roughly matching the same ratio we see in humans today. That means the person who killed Cranium 17 wasn't some monstrous outlier. Statistically, they were probably an ordinary right-handed individual, doing something ordinary right-handed people have apparently been capable of for at least 430,000 years. So when did the first murder actually happen? Honestly, we may never find the true first case. Bones this old rarely survive, and even when they do, most violence leaves no trace at all. What we do know is that intentional, targeted, face-to-face violence stretches back at least 430,000 years, deep into a time before language, before agriculture, before anything we'd recognize as civilization. Maybe the most unsettling part isn't that ancient humans were capable of this. It's that the evidence suggests they were doing it with the same right hand and the same basic motive, that violence still runs on today. 430,000 years, 10,000 years, or 4 years in a forest in Tanzania, the pattern barely changes at all. Do you think violence is something we're born with, or something the world around us creates? Let me know in the comments. And if you want the next video where I dig into the earliest evidence of human art, hit subscribe so you don't miss it.